The massive space station hung in the darkness like a silver jewel. It was bigger than most cities, with spinning rings that created artificial gravity for the thousands of beings living inside. This was the Galactic Defense Academy, where the best and brightest from across the galaxy came to learn how to keep peace between the stars. Hannah pressed her face against the small window of the transport ship. The station grew larger as they approached, and she could see other ships arriving from different directions. Each one carried new students from different worlds, different species, all coming to the same place for the same reason. The transport ship shuddered slightly as it docked. Hannah gathered her small bag and joined the line of beings walking toward the exit. She was much smaller than most of the others. The tall blue aliens with 4 arms towered over her. The rock-like beings made heavy footsteps that echoed through the metal corridors. Some aliens floated instead of walking. Others had tentacles instead of arms. Hannah looked like a child compared to them. She was just over 5 feet tall, with black hair tied back in a simple ponytail. Her uniform was the same gray color as everyone else's, but it seemed too big for her small frame. Nobody paid attention to her as they moved through the docking. The academy was impressive inside. The ceilings were high and decorated with symbols from dozens of different worlds. Floating screens showed information in languages Hannah couldn't read, but her translation device buzzed softly in her ear, turning the alien words into Korean. "New students report to the main auditorium," the pleasant voice said. Hannah followed the crowd through wide corridors. She noticed everything as she walked: the security cameras in the corners, the emergency exits marked with universal symbols, the way the corridors branched off in different directions. It was a habit she had developed back on Earth during her military training. The main auditorium was enormous. Thousands of seats arranged in curved rows, all facing a stage at the front. Hannah found an empty seat near the middle and sat down quietly. Around her, aliens of all shapes and sizes filled the other seats. Some were talking in groups, their voices creating a buzz of different languages and sounds. A massive alien walked onto the stage. He was at least 8 feet tall, with 4 powerful arms and skin that looked like it was made of blue crystal. His uniform had more decorations than the others, marking him as someone important. "I am Commander Vexstar," his voice boomed across the auditorium. "Welcome to the Galactic Defense Academy." The room fell silent. Even the floating aliens stopped moving. "You come from 17 different worlds," Commander Vexstar continued. "You speak different languages. You have different customs, you have different strengths, but you are here for the same purpose. You want to serve the galaxy. You want to keep peace between the stars." Hannah listened carefully. She had studied about the different alien species before coming here, but seeing them all together was different. The chromatics were huge and muscular, bred for war on their high-gravity world. The Zephyrians had large heads and glowing eyes, known for their mental powers. The Thesons looked like they were wearing natural armor, with thick plates covering their skin. "This academy will test you," Commander Vexstar said. "Not just your strength or your speed or your intelligence. It will test your judgment, your ability to see what others miss, your capacity to make the right choice when lives depend on it." Some of the alien students shifted in their seats. A few of the chromatics flexed their muscles. The Zephyrians' eyes glowed brighter. Everyone wanted to show they were ready for whatever came next. "Tomorrow morning, you will face your first examination," the commander announced. "It will not be what you expect. The best peacekeepers are not always the strongest or the fastest. They are the ones who can see danger before it strikes. They are the ones who can spot a threat in a crowd of innocents." Hannah tilted her head slightly. This sounded different from the combat training she had expected, more interesting. "Your first test will be simple," Commander Vexstar's 4 arms spread wide. "We call it the Threat Assessment Examination. You will sit in a room with your fellow students, you will observe, you will analyze, and you will identify which being in that room poses the greatest danger to galactic peace." Excited murmurs spread through the auditorium. Some students looked confident. Others seemed worried. A few were already studying their classmates, trying to figure out who might be the most dangerous. This test has been given to every class for the past 50 years, the commander continued. Most students fail. They see what they expect to see, they miss what is really there. Do not make the same mistake. The commander's crystal-like eyes swept across the crowd. For a moment, Hana felt like he was looking directly at her, but then his gaze moved on. You have the rest of today to settle into your dormitories and meet your fellow students. Classes begin tomorrow morning at 0800 Standard Time. Your first examination will be at 0900. Do not be late. As the students began to file out of the auditorium, Hana stayed in her seat for a few extra moments. She watched how different groups formed naturally. The chromatics gathered together, their deep voices rumbling as they talked about the test. The Zephyrians floated in a loose circle, probably communicating with their minds. The armored Thesans moved in formation like soldiers even here. Nobody approached her. She was used to that. Humans were still relatively new to the galactic community. Most aliens didn't know much about them except that they came from a small blue planet, and weren't particularly impressive in any obvious way. Hana picked up her bag and walked toward the exit. She moved quietly, almost invisibly through the crowd of larger beings. In the corridor outside, she found a directory screen and touched it with her finger. Her dormitory assignment appeared, Level 7, Section C. Room 147. The dormitory levels were quieter than the public areas. Each room was small but comfortable, with a bed, a desk, and a small storage area. Hana unpacked her few belongings and sat on the bed thinking about tomorrow's test, threat assessment. It sounded like the kind of problem she might actually be good at. Back on Earth, during her training with the Korean Special Forces, she had learned that the most dangerous enemies weren't always the ones who looked scary. Sometimes they were the ones who blended in, the ones who watched and waited, the ones who struck when nobody expected it. She opened her small notebook and began writing down what she had observed today, the layout of the academy, the different species of students, their apparent strengths and weaknesses, their behavior patterns. Outside her small window, the stars wheeled slowly as the space station rotated. Tomorrow would bring the first real test. Hana had a feeling it would be more interesting than most of her classmates expected. She closed her notebook and prepared for sleep. In a few hours, she would sit in a room full of aliens and try to spot the greatest threat among them. What none of them knew yet was that they should probably be looking at the quiet human girl who was already thinking 3 steps ahead. The morning alarm buzzed softly in Hana's room at exactly 0700 hours. She had been awake for 30 minutes already, lying in bed and listening to the sounds of the space station waking up. The ventilation systems hummed. Footsteps echoed in the corridors as other students headed to breakfast. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the deep voices of chromatic students talking in their native language. Hana got up and dressed quickly in her gray academy uniform. She ate a simple breakfast in her room, food she had brought from Earth in sealed packages. She wasn't sure about the alien food in the cafeteria yet, and today was too important to risk getting sick. At 0845, she made her way to the examination building. The corridors were full of students heading in the same direction. Most of them looked nervous or excited. Some were still talking about what the test might involve. Park Ji-won, a tall chromatic student, walked with a group of his species mates. His people were known for their strength and their pride. Back on his homeworld of Chromaxa, physical power was everything. He had trained since childhood to be a warrior, and his muscles showed it. This test is probably about fighting, Ji-won said to his friends. They want to see who is strongest. Who can defeat the others in combat? His friends nodded. It made sense to them. The strongest should lead. The weak should follow. This was the natural order of things. Kim Minho walked by himself. He was a Zephyrian, one of the species known for mental powers. His large head and glowing purple eyes marked him as different from the others. Zephyrians could read thoughts and project emotions, though Minho's abilities were still weak. He was hoping this test would let him use his mental gifts to succeed. Where physical strength would fail him. As they approached the examination building, Minho tried to read the surface thoughts of other students. Most species had natural mental defenses, but he could pick up emotions: fear, excitement, confidence, worry. The examination room was completely white. White walls, white ceiling, white floor. 50 chairs arranged in rows, all facing forward, toward a simple desk at the front. No decorations. No distractions, just empty space and furniture. "Find any seat," said a voice from speakers in the ceiling. "No assigned places. Sit wherever you feel comfortable." Park Ji-won immediately headed for the back row. From there, he could see everyone else. If this was about identifying threats, he wanted the best position to observe. Several other chromatic students had the same idea, and they spread out across the back seats. Kim Minho chose a seat in the middle section. He needed to be close enough to the other students to read their thoughts, but not so close that his own nervousness would be obvious. He settled into a chair in row 4 and began trying to scan the minds around him. The Thesan students moved like soldiers. Their thick, armored skin made clicking sounds as they walked. They took seats in formation, spacing themselves evenly throughout the room. If trouble started, they would be ready. Kirashen, a female Nagin, moved with liquid grace to a seat near the left wall. Her people were natural assassins with flexible bodies and venomous fangs. She had chosen a position where she could watch the exits while keeping most of the room in view. Her serpentine body coiled comfortably in the chair. More students filed in. Ziegler, whose people were literally engineered to be living weapons by a long-dead alien race, took a seat near the front. His metallic skin gleamed under the white lights. Yara, a void swimmer who could phase in and out of normal space, flickered slightly as she sat down, her nervous energy making her unstable. Hannah entered the room last. She paused in the doorway for just a moment, her eyes sweeping across the space. She noted the positions of the other students, the locations of the exits, the height of the ceiling, the placement of the ventilation grates. Then she walked calmly to row 3 and sat down in the 4th seat from the left. Nobody paid attention to her. She was small, quiet, and human. In a room full of warriors, telepaths, assassins, and living weapons, she seemed completely unremarkable. The door at the front of the room opened, and their instructor walked in. He was clearly a veteran. Scars crossed his chitinous face and arms. One of his 4 eyes was pale and blind. His movements were careful but confident. This was someone who had seen real combat. "I am Instructor Galfin," he said, his voice carrying easily through the room. "I have served the Galactic Defense Force for 32 years. I have seen war. I have seen peace. I have seen the difference between those who survive and those who do not." He walked to the desk at the front and turned to face the students. His 3 good eyes swept across the room, studying each face. "Your examination today is simple," Galfin continued. "Look around this room. Study your fellow students. In 30 minutes, I want you to write down which being in this room poses the greatest threat to galactic peace. Choose one. Explain your reasoning." The room became very quiet. Students began turning in their seats to look at each other with new interest. What had been casual observation before was now intense scrutiny. Hannah pulled out a small notebook and a pencil. While the other students stared at each other, she began sketching the room layout. She drew the positions of all the chairs, marked the exits, noted the sightlines. Her pencil moved steadily across the paper. Park Ji-won studied the room from his position in the back. The obvious threats were easy to spot. Ziegler, the living weapon, was clearly dangerous. Kirashen, the Nagin assassin, was built to kill. Several of the Thesan warriors looked like they could tear apart anyone who got in their way. Kim Minho tried to probe minds more deeply, but most species had defenses against telepaths. When he briefly touched the edge of Hannah's thoughts, he got a strange sensation. It wasn't like reading other minds. Instead of finding simple surface thoughts, he felt like he was looking into deep, still water. There was something there, but it was hidden far below the surface. Riven, a massive Thesan male, became aware that other students were staring at him. His people were known for their tempers and their warrior culture. He flexed his armored shoulders and glared back at anyone who met his eyes. If they wanted to see a threat, he would give them one. But Hannah wasn't looking at Riven or any of the other obvious dangers. She was sketching portraits now, small but detailed drawings of each student in the room. Her pencil captured not just their faces, but their posture, the way they held their hands, the angle of their shoulders. She was reading body language like a book. 20-5 minutes left on the clock. The tension in the room grew thicker. Students shifted in their seats. Some took notes. Others just stared. A few closed their eyes and tried to think through the problem logically. And in row 3, seat 4, Hannah continued drawing. She had mapped the room, cataloged the students, and identified 17 different tactical considerations that none of the others had even thought about. The hunt had begun, but only one person in the room understood that she was the hunter. 20 minutes remaining on the examination clock. The white room had transformed into a battlefield of minds, each student trying to analyze threats while being analyzed themselves. Riven, the massive Thesan warrior, had become the center of attention for many students. His natural armor plating gleamed under the harsh lights, and every movement he made created small clicking sounds as the plates shifted against each other. When he turned his head to look at someone, his neck muscles bulged impressively. Dex, a 6-armed Helix student, was taking careful notes about Riven. The Helix were natural analysts, their multiple limbs allowing them to write, calculate, and observe simultaneously. 3 of Dex's arms scribbled observations while the other 3 pointed at different students, measuring distances and angles. Thesan male, approximately 2.3 meters tall, Dex whispered to himself as he wrote. Muscle mass suggests combat training. Aggressive posturing indicates willingness to use violence. Species known for warrior culture and quick tempers. But Dex wasn't the only one watching Riven. Ohoun, a brilliant Altarian strategist, was running calculations in her head. Her people were known for their mathematical minds and logical thinking. She had already assigned numerical threat values to each species in the room based on their known capabilities. Thesan combat rating, 8.7 out of 10, she thought to herself. Chromatic rating, 8.2, Nagan rating, 7.9 for stealth kills. Living weapon rating, 9.4, the mathematics are clear. Several students had already written down their answers. To them, the choice seemed obvious. Pick the biggest, strongest, most obviously dangerous being in the room, but other students were thinking differently. Torvin, a crystalline being whose people communicated through harmonic frequencies, sent a subtle sound wave toward his neighbor. The message was simple. What about the small soft one in row 3? His neighbor, a floating gas cloud entity named Whisper, pulsed with confusion. The humans are weak. No natural weapons, no armor, no special abilities. Why would you consider her a threat? Torvin's crystal body chimed softly, the equivalent of a shrug. Sometimes the smallest predators are the most dangerous. On my world, the tiny crystal borers can bring down creatures 1,000 times their size. But most students dismissed this idea quickly. Humans were newcomers to the galactic community. They had only achieved space travel 200 years ago. Their planet was unremarkable, their technology basic, their physical capabilities limited. They were the definition of harmless. Kim Minho, the young Zephyrian telepath, was having trouble reading anyone clearly. Every species had evolved different mental defenses. The chromatics had simple, direct thoughts that were easy to block. The Thesons thought in battle formations that felt like running into a wall. The Nagan's minds were cold and serpentine, slippery and hard to grasp, but when he had briefly touched Hannah's mind earlier, it had been different. Not blocked or defended, but deep, like looking into a calm lake that might be 3 feet deep or 300 feet deep. There was no way to tell without diving in, and something told him that diving in might be dangerous. Minho decided to try again. He focused his telepathic abilities on the quiet human girl in row 3. She was still drawing in her notebook, her pencil moving with steady precision. Her face showed no emotion, no stress, no worry about the examination. As Minho's mind touched hers, he felt that same sensation of deep water. But this time, he caught a glimpse of what was beneath the surface. For just a moment, he saw through Hannah's eyes. The room looked completely different from her perspective. Where Minho saw 50 students sitting in chairs, Hannah saw a tactical situation. She had identified which students were left-handed or right-handed based on how they held their writing tools. She had noted which ones kept checking the exits and which ones had their backs to the doors. She had calculated reaction times based on how quickly they had responded to the instructor's entrance. More disturbing, Minho realized that Hannah had been watching him try to read her mind. She knew exactly what he was doing, and she was letting him see just enough to make him uncomfortable. Minho jerked back from the mental contact, his large eyes wide with surprise. Several students near him noticed his reaction and looked between him and Hannah with curiosity. Meanwhile, Kirashin, the Negan assassin, was conducting her own analysis. Her people were hunters, bred for patience and precision. She coiled more tightly in her chair and extended her forked tongue briefly, tasting the air for chemical signatures. Fear, excitement, nervousness, aggression, all the scents she expected from young beings trying to prove themselves. But from the direction of row 3, she detected something else. Calm, complete, absolute calm. The kind of calm that came from being perfectly confident in one's abilities. Kirashin had felt that scent only a few times before, always from the most dangerous predators on her homeworld. The ones who knew they were apex killers and felt no need to prove it. She shifted her position slightly to get a better view of Hannah. The human was still drawing, apparently unaware that she was being studied by one of the galaxy's most skilled natural assassins. But as Kirashin watched, she noticed something that made her serpentine spine tingle with unease. Hannah's drawings weren't random sketches. They were tactical diagrams. The room layout with optimal firing positions marked. Portrait sketches that focused on each being's vulnerable points and movement patterns. Notes written in human script that Kirashin couldn't read, but which looked suspiciously like threat assessments. The Negan assassin had spent her life learning to spot fellow predators. Right now, every instinct she had was screaming that she was looking at something far more dangerous than it appeared. 15 minutes left on the clock. Yara, the void swimmer, was having difficulty maintaining physical cohesion due to her nervousness. Parts of her body kept phasing in and out of normal space, creating a disturbing flickering effect. Several students had marked her as a threat simply because her abilities were unsettling, but Yara herself was focused on Park Sunho, a quiet chromatic student who had chosen a seat with a clear view of the entire room. Unlike his more boastful species mates, Sunho seemed to be thinking rather than just flexing. He had been watching the human girl with growing interest. Sunho had grown up on a frontier world where his family fought constant battles against raiders and hostile wildlife. He had learned early that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones you didn't see coming. His father had taught him to watch for the subtle signs, the way a predator moved, the patience it showed, the way it studied its prey before striking. As he watched Hannah work in her notebook, Sunho felt a familiar chill of recognition. He had seen that same focused calm in the tunnel cats that hunted near his home. They would sit motionless for hours, watching and waiting, gathering information about their targets before making a perfect, lethal strike. The human girl wasn't just taking notes. She was hunting, and none of her prey had even noticed. Sunho began writing his answer, his hand steady despite the magnitude of what he was realizing. Around him, other students continued to stare at the obvious threats, completely missing the apex predator sitting quietly in row 3. 10 minutes left. The real test wasn't identifying who looked dangerous. It was identifying who actually was dangerous, and only one student in the room understood the difference. 10 minutes remaining. The examination room buzzed with tension as students made their final assessments. Most had already decided on their answers, but a few were beginning to doubt their initial choices. Torvin, the crystalline being, sent another harmonic message to the students near him. His body chimed softly with frequencies that roughly translated to, "Look at behavior, not appearance." The small human moves like water, fluid, patient, dangerous. But his message was largely ignored. Most students were still fixated on the obvious. Threats. Ziegler, the living weapon, had metallic skin that could probably deflect most attacks. His very existence was a testament to an extinct race's ability to create perfect killers. How could anyone else in the room be more dangerous? Choi Suna, a female Zephyrian with stronger telepathic abilities than Kim Minho, decided to try a deeper mental probe of the room. Her people were naturally curious about other minds, and she wanted to understand what drove each student's thought processes. She started with the Thesan warriors. Their minds were straightforward, focused on honor and combat. Simple to read, if uninteresting. Next, she probed the chromatic students, their thoughts centered on strength and dominance. Again, predictable when she turned her attention to Hana. Suna expected to find the weak, confused thoughts of a primitive species struggling to keep up. Instead, she encountered something that made her telepathic abilities recoil in shock. Hana's mind wasn't defended in the way other species protected themselves from mental intrusion. Instead, it was like trying to read the thoughts of a hunting predator. Every mental pathway led to analysis, assessment, and calculation. Suna caught glimpses of tactical thinking so advanced and instinctive that it felt alien despite coming from a supposedly primitive human. In that brief contact, Suna saw how Hana viewed the room. Each student wasn't just a person to her, they were a collection of data points. Reaction time, based on muscle tension. Dominant hand, based on how they held their pencils. Stress levels, based on breathing patterns and micro-expressions. Probable. Combat training, based on posture and movement, most disturbing of all. Suna realized that Hana had been aware of every telepathic probe directed at her. The human had cataloged which students had mental abilities, how strong those abilities were, and had been feeding them just enough information to keep them curious without revealing her true capabilities. Suna broke the mental contact and stared at Hana with new understanding. The human girl looked up from her notebook at that exact moment and made brief eye contact with the Zephyrian. Hana's expression was polite and friendly, but her eyes held a depth that made Suna shiver. It was the look of a predator acknowledging another predator, but also letting them know who was really in charge. 8 minutes left on the clock. Oh, hound. The Altarian strategist was reviewing her mathematical calculations one more time. Her people believed that everything could be reduced to numbers and probabilities. She had assigned threat values to each species based on their known capabilities. Thesan warriors, high physical combat ability, moderate tactical thinking. Chromatic soldiers, very high strength, basic strategy. Nagan assassins, moderate physical ability, very high stealth and precision. Living weapons, maximum combat rating, limited independent thinking. Zephyrian telepaths, low physical ability, high mental manipulation. Helix analysts, moderate all-around capabilities, excellent multitasking, and humans, low physical ability, basic technology, minimal special traits. By every logical calculation, the humans should rank near the bottom of the threat assessment. Yet something bothered Hound about her analysis. She prided herself on mathematical precision, but there were variables she couldn't quantify. She watched Hana work and noticed details that didn't fit her calculations. The human's pencil movements were too precise, too economical. Her posture was relaxed but ready, like a spring under tension. Her breathing was controlled and steady despite being in a stressful situation. These weren't the behaviors of a weak, primitive being struggling to keep up. These were the behaviors of someone completely in control. Hound began to recalculate, adding new variables to her equation. What if human capabilities had been underestimated? What if their apparent weaknesses were actually advantages? What if, 200 years of contact with the galactic community hadn't been enough time to truly understand what humans were capable of? The mathematics began to shift in disturbing ways. Meanwhile, Park Ji-won, the confident chromatic warrior, was growing. Frustrated. He had expected this test to be straightforward. Identify the strongest fighter in the room, write down their name, collect his passing grade. But as he studied his fellow students, he began to realize that raw strength might not be what the instructors were looking for. His attention kept drifting back to Park Sun-ho, the quieter chromatic who had been watching the human girl with obvious concern. Sun-ho had grown up on dangerous frontier worlds, while Ji-won had trained in safe academy environments. If anyone would recognize a real threat, it would be someone with actual survival experience. "What do you see that I don't?" Ji-won whispered. To Sun-ho, Sun-ho didn't take his eyes off Hannah as he replied quietly, "She's not taking an exam. She's conducting reconnaissance." 6 minutes left. Kim Nari, the other human student sitting in row 7, had been having her own realizations. She had recognized what Hannah was doing from the moment she started sketching the room layout. During their shared training on Earth, they had learned the same techniques. The difference was that Nari felt nervous and out of place among all these alien warriors, and TELEPATHS. Hannah looked perfectly comfortable. Nari understood why most of the alien students were ignoring the humans. By galactic standards, their species was unremarkable. But what the aliens didn't know was that Earth had been a particularly hostile world. Humans hadn't evolved as apex predators because they had been too busy running from everything else that wanted to kill them. That experience had taught them to be very, very good at not being noticed while they figured out how to survive. Nari watched as several alien students continued to debate between the obvious threats. They were choosing based on what looked dangerous, not what actually was dangerous. It was like watching herbivores trying to spot predators. They only recognized the threats that announced themselves with roars and displays of strength. They had no idea how to identify a persistence hunter. 4 minutes remaining. Instructor. Galthan observed the room from his position at the front desk. In his 32 years of military service, he had given this examination hundreds of times. The results were usually predictable. Most students chose the biggest, strongest, most obviously threatening beings in the room. A few might pick the telepaths or the assassins. Very rarely, someone would identify the living weapons. In all his years of giving this test, only 12 students had ever chosen correctly. As he watched the current group, Galthan experienced eyes noted the same patterns he had seen countless times before. The Thesan getting more aggressive as he realized others were staring at him, the chromatic students flexing and posturing, the Negan assassin coiling with predatory grace, and sitting quietly in row 3, completely ignored by almost everyone. Was the actual most dangerous being in the room. Galthan had fought alongside humans during the border conflicts with the Nexus Rebellion. He had learned to respect their capabilities the hard way. Most galactic species still thought of humans as weak because they weren't immediately impressive. They didn't have natural armor or weapons or telepathic abilities. What they had was something far more dangerous: the patience to study their enemies and the intelligence to find weaknesses that others missed. 2 minutes left on the examination clock. Students were finishing their written answers, some confident in their choices, others still uncertain, and in row 3, Hannah closed her notebook and set down her pencil. She had been ready for the past 20 minutes. She had just been enjoying the opportunity to study so many different species in one place. It had been very educational. 1 minute remaining on the examination clock. The room had settled into tense quiet as students finished writing their answers. Pencils stopped moving, papers were shuffled. Nervous energy filled the air as everyone waited for time to be called. Lee Jinying, a young Helix student with 6 flexible arms, used his final moments to review what he knew about human history. The Helix were natural researchers, and he had spent considerable time studying the newest members of the galactic community. What he had learned was both fascinating and disturbing. Humans came from a world they called Earth, a planet that seemed determined to kill everything living on it. Most species evolved on worlds with stable climates and predictable dangers. Earth apparently had ice ages, asteroid impacts, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and weather systems that could destroy entire continents. The life forms on Earth had been forced to compete with each other in ways that most galactic species couldn't imagine. Humans weren't the strongest or fastest creatures on their world, but they had survived anyway. They had learned to be persistent hunters, tracking prey across vast distances until it collapsed from exhaustion. More importantly, they had learned to work together in ways that turned their individual weaknesses into collective strengths. A single human might not be dangerous, but humans rarely acted alone. Jinying glanced at the two human students in the room. Hannah in row 3, calm and focused. Kim Nari in row 7, who looked nervous but kept glancing at Hannah as if taking cues from her. Even here, in an examination that was supposed to test individual assessment, the humans were somehow coordinating. That realization made Jinying's skin prickle with unease. Time, Instructor Galphin announced. The word echoed through the white room like a gunshot. Students immediately stopped writing and set down their pencils. Some looked relieved. Others seemed worried they hadn't chosen correctly. Pass your papers forward, Galphin instructed. The rustling of paper filled the room as answers were collected. Hannah handed her single sheet forward with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the entire examination. Her handwriting was neat and precise, just like everything else about her. When all the papers had been gathered, Instructor Galphin moved to the front of the desk and looked out at the 50 students. His scarred face was unreadable, giving no hint about what he had seen in their answers. Before I read your responses, he said, I want you to understand something about this examination. It has been given to every class of cadets for 50 years. The failure rate is 96%. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few exchanged worried glances. Most of you have failed, Galphin continued. Not because you lack intelligence or observation skills, but because you see what you expect to see rather than what is actually there. He picked up the stack of papers and began reading responses aloud. He didn't identify who had written each answer, but his tone suggested he found most of them predictable. Response 1. The Thesan male in row 6. His species has a warrior culture that makes them unpredictable and violent. His body language shows aggression and willingness to fight. Riven. The Thesan in question sat up straighter in his chair. Several students glanced at him, wondering if he was indeed the correct answer. Response 2, the Negan female near the left wall. Her people are natural assassins with venomous fangs and stealth capabilities. She has positioned herself to watch the exits while monitoring the room. Kirushin's serpentine body coiled slightly, but her expression remained neutral. She had expected to be chosen by many students. Response 3, the living weapon designated. Ziegler. His entire existence is as an engineered combat unit. His metallic skin and enhanced reflexes make him the obvious threat. Ziegler's chrome-like surface reflected the room's white lights, but he showed no other reaction to being named. Galphin continued reading through the responses. Most followed the same pattern, choosing the beings who looked most obviously dangerous. A few students had picked the telepaths, reasoning that mental powers were harder to defend against than physical attacks. One student had chosen Aura, the void swimmer, because her ability to phase through matter made her unpredictable. Response 15, the human female in row 7. Humans are unknown quantities. Their species is new to the galactic community, so their capabilities might be underestimated. Kim Nari felt a moment of hope. At least someone had considered the humans as potential threats. But Galphin's tone suggested this wasn't the right answer either. Response 23, unable to determine. All species present have dangerous capabilities. More information would be needed to make an accurate assessment. That response drew murmurs from several students. Playing it safe seemed reasonable. When the stakes were unclear, Galphin worked through most of the stack, reading response after response that followed predictable patterns. The students began to realize that none of the answers they were hearing sounded like winning responses. The instructor's tone remained neutral, but there was a subtle disappointment in his voice. Finally, he reached the bottom of the stack. Only one paper remained unread. Response 50, Galphin said, and his tone changed slightly. There was approval in his voice now, mixed with something that might have been respect. The greatest threat in this room sits in row 3, position 4. Human female, approximately 1.6 meters tall, dark hair and ponytail. While every other student in this room spent 30 minutes staring at each other and making threat assessments based on obvious physical capabilities, she spent 30 minutes conducting detailed tactical reconnaissance. The room fell completely. Silent. Every head turned toward Hana, who looked up from her hands with mild curiosity, as if wondering why everyone was suddenly staring at her. She mapped the room layout, identified optimal firing positions, cataloged the strengths and weaknesses of every potential opponent, and calculated multiple attack and escape scenarios. She has been hunting while we have been posturing. Park Sunho, the chromatic who had written the correct response, felt a mixture of vindication and fear. He had been right about the human, but now he realized just how right he had been. She knows this room better than anyone else now, Galphin continued reading. She knows which students are left-handed or right-handed based on their writing habits. She knows who has combat training based on their posture and movement patterns. She knows who is nervous and who is confident based on their breathing and micro-expressions. Troy Suna, the Zephyrian telepath who had briefly touched Hannah's mind, felt her large eyes grow even wider. The mental contact had shown her glimpses of tactical thinking, but she hadn't realized the full scope of what the human had been doing. Most importantly, Galphin read from the final response, she has remained completely unnoticed by her targets while gathering this intelligence. She presents no obvious threat displays, triggers no defensive reactions, and has positioned herself to observe maximum information while maintaining optimal tactical positioning. The instructor set down the paper and looked directly at Hannah. Would you care to confirm or deny this assessment? Hannah stood up slowly, and something about her movement was different now. The harmless, nervous student was gone. In her place was something that moved with quiet confidence and controlled precision. The assessment is accurate, she said simply. Her voice was calm and clear, carrying easily through the silent room. Several students leaned away from her unconsciously. The change in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. She had been hiding in plain sight, and now she was allowing them to see what had been there all along. Would you be willing to demonstrate? Galphin asked. Hannah nodded and opened her notebook. I can tell you 17 different ways to incapacitate or eliminate every being in this room using only materials present in this space. I know which of you favor your left or right side, who has slower reflexes, who telegraphs their movements, and who would be most likely to panic under pressure. The silence in the room was deafening. 50 of the galaxy's most promising young beings suddenly felt like prey animals, who had just realized there was a predator among them, and the predator had been watching them the entire time. The white examination room felt smaller now, as if the walls had moved closer. 50 students stared at the small human female, who had just announced she could eliminate any of them using only what was available in the room. The casual way she said it made it more frightening than any threat display could have been. Hannah walked slowly to the front of the room, her notebook in her hand. Her movement was different from when she had entered 30 minutes earlier. There was no nervous hesitation, no uncertainty about her place among the larger, more obviously dangerous aliens. She moved like someone who belonged exactly where she was. May I use the display screen? She asked Instructor Galphin politely. Galphin nodded and stepped aside. A holographic display materialized in the air above his desk, large enough for everyone in the room to see clearly. Hannah opened her notebook and began projecting her sketches onto the screen. The first image showed the room layout with mathematical precision. Every chair was marked, every exit labeled, every structural detail noted. It looked like something a military engineer might produce after hours of careful measurement. I began by mapping the space, she explained, her voice calm and educational. Ceiling height, 4.2 meters. 3 exits, main door, emergency exit left. Wall, maintenance access panel, right wall. Ventilation system accessible through ceiling grates. Structural support beams at these positions. She pointed to various locations on her diagram. Several students glanced up at the ceiling, realizing they had never even noticed the ventilation grates or support beams. The next image showed seating arrangements, with detailed notes about each student's position. But these weren't just seat numbers, they were tactical assessments. Row 1, 3 Thesan warriors, spacing suggests defensive formation training. Row 2, mixed species, no apparent coordination. Row 3, myself, optimal observation position with clear sight lines to all areas. She flipped to the next sketch, which showed individual portraits of students with notations that made several beings shift uncomfortably in their seats. Ziegler. Front row center, metallic skin suggests energy weapon resistance, but joints show flexibility points here and here. Probable weakness to sonic attacks based on head construction. Ziegler's chrome-like surface seemed to dim slightly. He had never considered that his engineered advantages might also create exploitable weaknesses. Kiroshin, row 4 left, Negan physiology optimized for striking and constriction. Serpentine spine vulnerable to impact at third vertebrae section. Reaction time approximately 0.3 seconds based on eye movement patterns. The Negan assassin uncoiled slightly, her forked tongue flicking out nervously. She had spent her life being the predator in any room she entered. Being analyzed like prey was a completely new experience. Riven, row 6 center, Thesan armor plating provides excellent frontal protection. Gap between plates at shoulder joint measures approximately 2.1 centimeters. Large muscle mass suggests power over speed, estimated reaction time 0.8 seconds. For direction changes. Riven's armored shoulders flexed involuntarily. He had trained his entire life for combat, but no one had ever dissected his capabilities so clinically before. Hannah continued through her notebook, displaying analysis of student after student. She had identified the dominant hand of each being, based on how they held their writing tools. She had noted which ones kept checking the exits and which ones had turned their backs to potential escape routes. She had calculated probable combat experience based on posture, movement patterns, and stress responses. Park Jiwon, the confident chromatic warrior, found himself described as row 8 left, chromatic male, approximately 2.1 meters, academy trained. Based on textbook posture, likely limited real combat experience. Favors right-hand attacks, slow to defend left side. Muscular but not scarred strength without experience equals predictable patterns. It was accurate enough to be embarrassing. Kim Minho, the young Zephyrian telepath, was catalogued as row 4 center, Zephyrian male, developing telepathic abilities. Mental probes detectable and weak, approximately level 3 on standard scale. Large cranium creates balance issues, slower physical reactions to compensate. Minho's glowing eyes dimmed with humiliation. His telepathic abilities were his pride, and she had dismissed them as amateur level. "This is impossible," Ohound, the Altarian strategist, spoke up from her seat. "You couldn't have gathered this much detailed information in 30 minutes. No one processes data that quickly." Hannah turned to look at her directly. Row 5 right, Altarian female, mathematical thinking pattern evident in note-taking organization. Logical mind, probably calculating threat probabilities. Strength in. Analysis, weakness, and rapid adaptation to unexpected variables. Hound fell silent, realizing that her interruption had just provided Hannah with additional data points about her personality and thinking patterns. "The human is correct," Instructor Galthan said into the stunned silence. She processed more tactical intelligence in 30 minutes than most trained operatives gather in hours of observation. Torvin, the crystalline being who had tried to warn others about the small soft one, chimed a harmonic that roughly translated to nervous laughter. "My people have a saying, the most dangerous predators don't announce themselves with roars, I tried to tell you." "But how?" asked Dex, the 6-armed Helix student. "Humans are supposed to be primitive. Your species only achieved spaceflight 2 centuries ago. Your technology is basic. Your physical capabilities are limited." Hannah smiled, and for the first time since the examination began, she looked genuinely amused rather than simply polite. Our technology is basic because we learned to survive without relying on it, she said. Our physical capabilities are limited because we learned to win fights using intelligence instead of strength. And we've been spacefaring for 2 centuries. Because we spent the previous 10,000 years learning how to kill everything on a planet that was actively trying to kill us first. She moved to the center of the room, and students unconsciously leaned away from her as she passed their seats. Every species in this room evolved as either apex predators or as prey animals that developed defenses. You became strong or fast, or armored or telepathic or venomous. You learned to dominate your environment through superior capabilities. She paused near Karashine's seat, and the Negan assassin coiled defensively. Humans evolved as persistence hunters on a world where everything was bigger, stronger, faster, and more dangerous than we were. We learned to survive not by being superior, but by being more patient, more adaptable, and more willing to do whatever it took to win. Yara, the void swimmer, flickered in and out of phase nervously. But you look so harmless. That's the point, Hannah replied simply. The best hunters don't look like hunters until it's too late. She returned to the front of the room and closed her notebook. For 30 minutes you all stared at each other looking for obvious threats, warriors with big muscles, assassins with natural weapons, living weapons with metal skin, telepaths with glowing eyes. You looked for danger that announced itself. Her voice remained calm and educational, but there was something underneath it now that made every being in the room pay complete attention. While you were doing that, I was learning everything I needed to know to defeat every single one of you. And none of you noticed because I didn't look dangerous enough to pay attention to. The room was completely silent except for the soft hum of the ventilation system, the same ventilation system that Hannah had identified as a potential access route in her first 5 minutes in the room. This, she concluded, is why you should never underestimate humans. We've been practicing this exact scenario for our entire evolutionary history. We just usually do it to things that are trying to eat us. The door at the back of the examination room opened with a soft hiss, and Commander Vextar entered. His 4-armed crystalline form seemed to fill the doorway as he stepped inside. The commander's presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room, and every student straightened in their seats. I have been observing this examination through the security feeds, Commander Vextar announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded fleets and fought in wars between the stars. What you have witnessed here is precisely why the Galactic Defense Academy exists. He walked slowly down the center aisle, his crystal-like skin refracting the white light into small rainbows that danced across the walls. As he moved, his 4 eyes swept across the students, noting their reactions, their posture, their newfound wariness around the small human female who had just dismantled all their assumptions. 50 years ago, when this examination was first created, the average score was 12%. Today it remains 12%. Do you know why? Nobody answered. The room was still processing what had just happened. Because every generation of cadets makes the same mistake, the commander continued. You look for threats that match your expectations. You search for danger that fits your preconceived notions about what dangerous means. He stopped near Hannah's row and turned to face the entire class. You see a Thesan warrior and think dangerous, because their species has a reputation for combat. You see a Negan assassin and think deadly because their people are known for stealth kills. You see a living weapon and think threat because their very existence is martial. Commander Vextar's voice grew quieter, but somehow more intense. What you fail to recognize is that all of those threats announce themselves. They are obvious, they are expected. And in real peacekeeping situations, the obvious threats are rarely the ones that kill you. Riven, the Thesan warrior who had been chosen as a threat by multiple students, spoke up. But Commander, surely physical capability must count for something. In combat situations, strength and armor provide real advantages. Of course they do, Vextar agreed. And that is exactly why you will never be assigned to infiltration missions, or deep cover operations, or situations requiring subtle analysis of complex threats. Your capabilities make you valuable in direct confrontation scenarios. They also make you completely unsuitable for other types of work. The commander's forearms gestured toward different sections of the room. Each species here has evolved specific advantages. Thesans are excellent frontline warriors. Nagans make superior individual assassins. Chromatics provide heavy assault capabilities. Zephyrions excel at information gathering through telepathy. These are all valuable roles in maintaining galactic peace. He turned to look directly at Hana, but humans ... Humans fill a different role entirely. Several students shifted uncomfortably. The way the commander was looking at the small human female made it clear that her demonstration had not been a surprise to him. This examination was designed by humans, Commander Vextar revealed, and shocked murmurs rippled through the room. 50 years ago, when humanity first joined the Galactic Defense Force, our existing threat assessment protocols were failing catastrophically. We were losing agents, missing dangerous situations, and completely failing to identify real threats in complex scenarios. He began walking again, moving between the rows of students like a teacher delivering a crucial lesson. The human military advisors who reviewed our training protocols asked one simple question: why are you teaching students to spot the predators that want to be seen? They pointed out that the most dangerous threats in any real situation would be the ones actively trying to avoid detection. Kim Minho, the young Zephyrian telepath, raised his hand tentatively. Commander, if humans are so effective at threat assessment, why aren't there more of them in the Defense Force? Because, Commander Vextar replied, we don't assign humans to combat roles. The statement hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Humans are not deployed as peacekeepers or frontline defenders or rapid response teams, the commander continued. They are assigned to tactical analysis, threat assessment, intelligence gathering, and strategic planning, because we learned very quickly that putting humans in combat situations creates a different kind of problem entirely. Kirashan, the Nagan assassin, uncoiled slightly from her defensive posture. What kind of problem? Commander Vextar's expression became grimmer, the kind where your enemies stop surrendering. The room fell into complete silence. Even the ventilation system seemed to quiet down. I fought alongside human units during the Nexus Rebellion 15 years ago, the commander said, his voice taking on the tone of someone recounting personal experience. The enemy had developed new tactics specifically designed to counter our standard peacekeeping protocols. They were using our own restraint and rules of engagement against us. He stopped walking and stood at the front of the room, all four arms clasped behind his back. The humans we had assigned to tactical analysis roles kept requesting permission to solve the problem directly. We kept refusing, insisting that peacekeepers don't kill unless absolutely necessary. After 3 months of escalating casualties, we finally asked them what they meant by solving the problem directly. Commander Vextar paused, and Hana's expression became very carefully neutral. They had identified every enemy command structure, supply line, communication hub, and leadership hierarchy. They had calculated exactly how to eliminate the rebellion's capacity to fight in a way that would minimize total casualties and end the conflict permanently. The plan was thorough, efficient, and absolutely terrifying in its scope. Several students glanced at Hana with new understanding. She looked like a small, harmless student, but there was something in her stillness that suggested vast depths of controlled capability. We implemented their plan, the commander continued. The rebellion ended in 6 days. Total casualties, less than 3% of what we had projected for a conventional campaign. But the enemy leadership didn't just surrender, they begged for terms. They were convinced they were fighting against some kind of death cult that could strike anywhere, anytime, without warning. Ohan, the Altarian strategist, asked the question that everyone was thinking, what made the enemy so frightened? Because the humans had been fighting the rebellion like humans fight everything else, Commander Vextar replied. They studied their enemy with patience that bordered on obsession. They identified every weakness, every pattern, every vulnerability, and then they struck with precision that left no room for recovery or retaliation. He turned to address the entire class. This is why you failed today's examination. You were looking for threats that would fight you on your terms, using capabilities you understood, following rules of engagement that made sense to your way of thinking. Commander Vextar gestured toward Hana again. But humans don't fight on anyone else's terms. They don't announce their intentions. They don't engage in displays of dominance or intimidation. They simply study, plan, and act. By the time you realize a human considers you a threat, the situation is already over. Park Sun-ho, the chromatic student who had correctly identified Hana as the greatest threat, raised his hand. Commander, how do we learn to recognize this kind of danger? You start by understanding that the most dangerous beings in any situation are often the ones who don't look dangerous. Commander Vextar replied. They are the ones who watch instead of posing. The ones who ask questions instead of making statements. The ones who remain calm when everyone else is displaying emotion. He looked around the room one final time. Remember this lesson, cadets. In the field, your survival may depend on recognizing that true threats don't always roar. Sometimes they sit quietly in row 3, taking notes and learning everything they need to know to defeat you. The commander moved toward the exit, then paused at the door. Class dismissed. Except for you, Cadet Lee. Please remain for debriefing. As the other students filed out of the room, they gave Hana a wide berth. The small human female who had entered with them that morning was still the same person, but now they understood what she actually was. She was the apex predator they had never learned to recognize. The white examination room emptied slowly as 49 students filed out through the main door. They moved differently than they had when entering that morning. There was a new awareness in their movements, a wariness that hadn't existed before. They spoke in hushed tones as they walked, occasionally glancing back toward the small human female who remained seated in row 3. Hana sat quietly, her notebook closed on her lap, waiting as requested. She showed no signs of nervousness or concern about being asked to stay behind. If anything, she looked mildly curious about what would come next. Commander Vextar and Instructor Galfin watched the last student leave, then moved to the front of the room. The door sealed behind the departing cadets with a soft hiss, leaving the 3 of them alone in the sterile white space. Cadet Lee, Commander Vextar said, his forearms folded across his chest. That was an impressive demonstration. Thank you, sir, Hana replied simply. How much of it was planned? Hana tilted her head slightly, considering the question. The tactical analysis was automatic. The demonstration was improvised based on the situation. The psychological impact was predictable. Instructor Galfin moved closer, his scarred face showing genuine interest. In my 32 years of giving this examination, only 12 students have ever identified the human correctly. You've been observed by hundreds of alien cadets over the years. Most dismiss you as harmless. That's the advantage, Hana said matter-of-factly. Humans learned early that being underestimated is often more valuable than being feared. Commander Vextar activated a holographic display that showed detailed psychological profiles and test scores. Your written examinations place you in the 97th percentile for tactical analysis, the 99th percentile for pattern recognition, and the 85th percentile for combat simulation scenarios. He gestured to another set of data. But your physical capability scores are only in the 40th percentile. Your technology aptitude is in the 52nd percentile. By most galactic standards, you should be assigned to support roles, not frontline analysis. Most galactic standards assume that individual capability determines effectiveness, Hana replied. Human military doctrine is based on different principles. Explain, Instructor Galfin requested. Hana stood and walked to the holographic display, studying the data with professional interest. Every species in the galaxy evolved to be individually superior in some way. Thisans became individually stronger. Nagans became individually stealthier. Zephyrians became individually more intelligent. Your military tactics reflect this. You use superior individuals to overcome inferior opposition. She gestured toward the psychological profile still floating in the air. Humans evolved differently. We became collectively superior through cooperation, but we also became individually adaptable through necessity. Our home world forced us to develop pattern recognition, threat assessment, and survival instincts that assume everything around. US is trying to kill us. Commander Vexstar leaned forward, his crystalline features reflecting the holographic light. You're saying that human paranoia is actually an evolutionary advantage? Not paranoia, Hannah corrected. Awareness. Humans developed the ability to see threats that don't announce themselves because the ones that did announce themselves were never the ones that actually killed us. She moved back toward her seat but remained standing. A roaring predator gives you time to run or fight back. A patient predator that studies your behavior and waits for the perfect moment to strike. That's what shaped human survival instincts for millions of years. Instructor Galfin nodded slowly. That's why you were able to analyze the other students so effectively. You were treating them as potential threats from the moment you entered the room. Every human treats every new situation as potentially threatening until proven otherwise, Hannah confirmed. It's not conscious hostility, it's just thorough preparation. Commander Vexstar accessed another set of files on the holographic display. According to these records, you specifically requested assignment to the Galactic Defense Academy. Most human military personnel are recruited directly into analysis roles. Why did you want cadet training? For the first time since the examination began, Hannah's expression showed something other than calm professionalism. She looked curious, because I wanted to understand how other species think about conflict and cooperation, she said. Humans have only been part of the galactic community for 200 years. We are still learning how to work with species that evolved under different pressures. She gestured toward the door where the other students had exited. Today's examination taught me more about alien psychology than months of theoretical study. I learned how Thesans display dominance, how Nagans assess territory, how chromatics establish hierarchy, how Zephyrians process social information. And what will you do with that knowledge? Galfin asked. Use it to be a better peacekeeper, Hannah replied immediately. Understanding how different species perceive threats is essential for preventing conflicts before they start. Commander Vexstar's 4 eyes studied her carefully. You realize that your performance today will change how the other cadets interact. With you for the rest of your training? Yes, sir. They will be wary of you. Some may be frightened. Others may be resentful. A few might try to prove themselves by challenging you directly. I understand. How do you plan to handle that? Hannah smiled, and for the first time it looked completely genuine rather than politely professional. The same way humans always handle being surrounded by beings who are bigger, stronger, and more dangerous than we are. I'll be patient, observant, and adaptable. I'll learn from every interaction. And I'll never let them forget that underestimating humans is a mistake. She picked up her notebook and moved toward the door. But I'll also remember that they're not actually my enemies. They're my future colleagues. Understanding their capabilities and limitations will make us all more effective as a team. As she reached the door, Commander Vexstar called after her. Cadet Lee, she turned back to face him, welcome to the academy. I think you're going to fit in just fine. Hannah nodded respectfully and left the room. As the door sealed behind her, she could hear Commander Vexstar and Instructor Galfin beginning to discuss her performance in low voices. The corridor outside was mostly empty now. The other cadets had returned to their dormitories or gone to the cafeteria for lunch. Hannah walked quietly through the halls, noting the changes in how others looked at her when she passed. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others stared with obvious curiosity. A few nodded with what might have been newfound respect. Park Sun-ho, the chromatic student who had correctly identified her as the threat, fell into step beside her as she walked. That was well done, he said simply. Thank you. Your analysis was accurate too. I grew up on a frontier world. I learned to recognize predators early. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment before Sunho asked, "What happens now?" Hana considered the question. "Now we learn how to work together." The examination was about individual threat assessment. Real peacekeeping is about collective problem solving. "And you think the others will be able to work with you after today?" Hana glanced at him with mild amusement. "They worked with you? And you were the one who figured out what I was doing." Sunho laughed, a deep rumbling sound. "Fair point." As they reached the dormitory section, Hana paused at the intersection where their paths diverged. "Sunho? Yes? Thank you for writing the correct answer. It made the lesson more effective." He looked at her curiously. "You wanted to be identified?" "I wanted the other cadets to learn something important about assumptions and threat recognition. Someone had to see through the misdirection or the lesson wouldn't work." Sunho stared at her for a moment, then shook his head with what might have been admiration or concern. "Humans really do think differently, don't they?" "We think like prey animals that learn to hunt," Hana replied. "It makes us daro." As she walked toward her room, Hana reflected on the day's events. The examination had gone exactly as she had hoped. The other cadets now understood that appearances could be deceiving, that real threats might not announce themselves, and that effective analysis required looking beyond obvious assumptions. More importantly, they had learned that humans belonged here not despite their apparent limitations, but because of capabilities that others hadn't recognized. Tomorrow would bring new classes, new challenges, and new opportunities to learn about her alien colleagues. But today had established the foundation for everything that would follow. The quiet human girl in row 3 was no longer invisible. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she had evolved to do, surviving, adapting, and turning every disadvantage into an unexpected strength, and in a galaxy full of beings who had learned to dominate through superior individual capabilities. That might be the most dangerous trait of all.